April 10th, 1945, outskirts of Bremen. 3:47 a.m. A low fog hung over the wet fields of northern Germany, swallowing light and muffling sound. Inside a dimly lit underground bunker, a technician adjusted the frequency dial of a Freya radar station for the third time in 10 minutes. Still nothing. The screen remained flat, no echoes, no waves bouncing back. The sky was silent. He frowned. The equipment was working. Power levels were nominal. Connections intact. No interference. Pulses, but where there was only void. He leaned back, pulled off his headphones, and turned to his superior. "The screen's clean, sir. Nothing in the air." The officer didn't move. He stared at the radar for a few seconds longer, his eyes narrowing as if trying to see through the silence. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently. Birds scattered, and still, machines remained blind. For 5 years, the German Reich had depended on these radar systems. They were the invisible wall, guarding their cities, factories, and secrets. The Freya and Würzburg units were the early eyes of the Luftwaffe, seeing beyond clouds, beyond nightfall, beyond human limits. These machines had been their insurance against surprise. And now, in the final weeks of a crumbling war, those eyes had suddenly gone dark. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't a glitch. Something else was up there. Something the machines couldn't see. At 3:51 a.m., distant thunder rolled over the horizon. Except there were no clouds. Just a deep, rhythmic hum, like a low organ note played by an unseen hand. It grew louder, closer. The ground began to vibrate beneath their boots. And still, the radar showed nothing. The officer stepped outside, squinting into the moonlight. The air trembled. The sound was approaching fast, now unmistakably mechanical, but the sky above appeared empty. Then came the explosion, not near the bunker, but several kilometers west, in the direction of a munitions depot recently relocated from Hanover. A brief flash, a dull roar, a tower of smoke rising into the cold night sky. No alarm had sounded, no alert had been triggered, and as the flames painted the clouds orange, the realization settled in. Whatever had done this had never appeared on their screens. Inside the bunker, no one spoke. The silence now had weight. The technician stared at the radar, still blinking steadily, still blind. He whispered to no one in particular. "We didn't even see it coming." That was the first confirmed strike attributed to what American intelligence had quietly begun calling the invisible wing. To the German command, it was a myth, a misreading, maybe a lucky shot from a rogue unit. But for the few who had heard the sound without seeing the source, something deeper had shifted. An instinctual fear, the feeling of being hunted by something that didn't cast a shadow. Back in Berlin, skepticism reigned. When a decrypted Allied message hinted at a non-reflective bomber test over Europe, some officers laughed. A bomber that doesn't appear on radar? They chuckled and rolled their eyes. Perhaps next we'll be fighting ghosts. But inside the intelligence circles, especially among those who had studied early Allied experiments with radar-absorbing materials, the tone began to change. There had been whispers months earlier of engineers in the Nevada desert sketching triangular silhouettes, of night test flights that left no trace on British radars, of prototypes, too unstable for combat, too experimental, too impossible. Yet here they were, facing fires without explanation, silhouettes without shadows, sounds without source. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to exist, but it did. And for the first time in the war, the Reich was truly blind. Those who had once mocked the idea of an invisible plane now found themselves questioning the very ground they stood on. What if the Americans had pulled it off? What if, while Germany invested in rockets and jet fighters, the Allies had quietly bent the laws of detection itself? No one could say for sure. And that was the terrifying part, because when you can't see your enemy, you can't fight him. When your radar lies to you, your instincts follow. And when your eyes no longer work, even the safest skies feel hostile. For the men in that radar bunker, the war had just entered a new phase, one they were unprepared for. A war not of firepower, but of invisibility, of silence, of doubt. The following morning, the Reich Ministry of Armaments received a fragmented report. 1 installation destroyed, 0 aircraft detected. Equipment verified. Enemy presumed undetected. There was no fury, no rage, just confusion. And in that confusion, something broke. Not a machine, a mindset. The belief that technology could always see what the eye could not had just been shattered. From this moment forward, every silent second on the radar screen would no longer mean safety. It would mean fear. And now, before we uncover what truly caused the sky to go dark that night, take a moment to support this channel. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe to help us keep sharing these forgotten moments from the edge of history. In the early months of 1945, inside a dimly lit war room in Berlin, a circle of German intelligence officers gathered around a large oak table. The air was thick with smoke from hand-rolled cigarettes and the dry heat of overworked radiators. Maps lay unfolded, red strings, crisscrossed pins like spiderwebs across the walls. A courier had just delivered an intercepted Allied transmission. Nothing unusual at first glance, until one phrase caught their attention. Low observable aircraft testing complete. Results confirm profile minimal on current German radar range. The room fell silent. One officer raised an eyebrow, another scoffed. Then a snort, followed by quiet laughter. Minimal on German radar? One of them repeated. What is it now? A plane made of glass. There was mockery in their tone, but also something more subtle. A hint of discomfort, the same discomfort that often precedes denial. They dismissed the document as exaggeration. The Americans, they reasoned, had fallen for their own propaganda. Surely this was another overhyped experiment that would never survive the European theater. After all, American planes were loud, heavy, and bright in the sky. Everyone knew that. The B-17 was a flying brick. The P-47 was a metal hammer. And the P-51s, for all their elegance, still screamed through the air like angry bees. None of them had ever been silent. None of them had ever disappeared. The idea of an invisible aircraft? That was laughable. Within days, the rumor had trickled through the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, field officers passing whispers across occupied territories. In Paris, a captured British spy hinted that the Allies had deployed a new kind of aircraft, something experimental, something ghost-like. He claimed it flew without sound, without trail, without detection. The interrogation report was filed and forgotten. It sounded ridiculous. One informant stationed in the Netherlands reported seeing strange flight patterns at dusk, planes that shifted direction without warning and seemed to fade into the clouds. He was told not to file another report unless he had photographs. Fantasies and nerves had no place in wartime intelligence. Meanwhile, inside a Luftwaffe engineering division in Dresden, blueprints from intercepted Allied freight were examined. Among them, sketches of a strange triangle-shaped fuselage. No vertical tail, no cockpit bubble, just a sweeping wing like a manta ray in flight. The design was alien to most German engineers. It looked more like a bird than a bomber. Clearly a failed prototype, one of them remarked, sipping black coffee. No stability. It would tumble out of the sky. He wasn't wrong. The early iterations of these American designs were unstable, dangerous even. Many test flights ended in crashes. Pilots reported terrifying shaking at low altitudes and unpredictable lift at high speeds. The United States Air Force had nearly shelved the program in 1944, but a small group of engineers, many inspired by the German Horten brothers' own flying wing, refused to give up. And that irony was thick in the air. While the Nazis mocked the idea of a stealth aircraft, part of its very DNA had been born in German minds. The Horten Ho 229, a jet-powered, flying wing developed by the Third Reich, shared an eerie resemblance to what the Americans were now refining in secret. The Germans had created the concept, but lacked the time, fuel, and industrial stability to finish it. Now, the tables were turning. While Allied factories in California and Nevada pushed the envelope on radar cross-section and noise suppression, German facilities were bombed weekly. Blueprints were lost. Scientists reassigned to rocket programs. The Reich's technological edge was slipping, not because of lack of genius, but because the war had outpaced its ability to adapt. Yet the attitude among many in the German high command remained unchanged, a dangerous combination of pride and tunnel vision. They laughed at the very idea that the Americans, those industrial bulldozers of war, could produce something elegant, refined, and invisible. To them, American aircraft were tools, mass-produced and crude, Powerful, yes, but not clever. They underestimated what happens when you combine money, desperation, and a problem that engineers refuse to walk away from. In a backroom of the Reich Air Ministry, a grizzled colonel pinned a report to the board with a rusted tack. He read it out loud to his aide. Unknown aircraft, no visual confirmation. Radar contact lost, target location compromised, possible sabotage, no survivors. The aide looked confused. Do we believe this? The colonel shrugged. No, but I don't like that I can't explain it. Even now, with flames on the Eastern Front and Allied troops crossing the Rhine, there remained a quiet arrogance that shielded many within the regime from reality. The idea that their enemy could leapfrog them technologically, especially in aviation, was an insult too bitter to accept. So they ignored the signs, they laughed at the documents, they dismissed the informants, and by the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late. That laughter, once sharp and mocking, would fade into stunned silence. And as that silence settled over their radar stations, command rooms, and airfields, a new kind of fear began to grow. A fear not of what they could see, but of what they could not. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden history of World War II, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts and subscribe to the channel to help us bring these stories out of the shadows and into the light. In the California desert, where the wind carves dust into silence and the horizon feels endless, strange shape began to rise from the sand. It didn't look like a plane, not to the test pilots, not to the mechanics, and certainly not to the generals who arrived in polished cars to inspect its progress. It looked like something out of a dream or a mistake. No fuselage, no vertical tail, no obvious cockpit bubble, just a single sweeping wing, like the spine of a bird that had never evolved to land. It was smooth and silver and eerily flat, its surface catching the sun like a blade. This was the Northrop YB-49, the aircraft that wasn't supposed to exist. Its predecessor, the XB-35, had been designed as a propeller-driven flying wing, a bold experiment, but one plagued by vibration issues, cooling problems, and unstable handling. Engineers knew the idea was ahead of its time, but Jack Northrop, founder of the Northrop Corporation and one of the few visionaries in aviation history to dream in pure aerodynamics, refused to give up. When jet engines became viable, the team ripped the pistons from the airframe and installed 8 turbojets across the trailing edge. What emerged from that modification was the YB-49, faster, meaner, stranger. From above, it resembled a manta ray. From the side, it seemed impossibly thin. It was the kind of machine that dared nature to try and catch it. But the design was not about beauty. It was about physics. Traditional aircraft had vertical stabilizers, rudders, and fuselages that reflected radar waves like mirrors. The YB-49 did not. Clean profile and smooth contours made it incredibly difficult to detect. Radar signals simply slid across its surface and dispersed. It wasn't invisible in the supernatural sense. It was invisible in the way a whisper gets lost in a storm. When test flights began, radar operators nearby were puzzled. At certain angles, the aircraft would vanish entirely from their screens. Not fade, vanish. It wasn't just a reduction in signal. It was an absence, a silence in the data. That silence became its greatest weapon. Of course, the YB-49 had problems, serious ones. It was hard to fly. The lack of vertical stabilizers made yaw control a nightmare. At high speeds, the jet engines produced uneven thrust. Pilots had to work constantly just to keep it stable. Some flights ended in emergency landings. One ended in death. In 1948, a YB-49 crashed during a test flight over California. All 5 crew members were killed. Among them was Captain Glenn Edwards, whose name would later be given to the base, where many experimental aircraft would be born, Edwards Air Force Base. Despite the setbacks, the concept refused to die. Military planners saw something in the aircraft that went beyond performance charts. They saw a glimpse of future warfare, a way to move undetected, to strike without warning, to erase the line between air power and silence. The aircraft's unusual radar profile caught the attention of specialists in electronic warfare. They realized that even if it wasn't a perfect bomber, it was a proof of concept. It proved that shape mattered, that noise and visibility were no longer the defining factors of air superiority, that the next war might not be won by speed or firepower, but by who could be seen the least. Curiously, the inspiration for the flying wing wasn't entirely American. In the late stages of the war, U.S. forces had captured blueprints and prototypes of the Horten Ho 229, a German jet-powered flying wing developed by the Horten brothers. It, too, had reduced radar visibility. It, too, looked like it came from tomorrow. But where the Germans had stopped, the Americans advanced. What the Reich had imagined, the U.S. was already building at scale. The YB-49 wasn't just a plane, it was an evolution in thinking. Its clean silhouette became the basis for what would one day become stealth technology. Its flaws would teach engineers what to avoid. Its strengths would redefine what to pursue. Years later, when the B-2 Spirit emerged from the shadows, its roots could be traced directly back to the YB-49. The same lines, the same principles, but refined by decades of materials science and digital flight control systems the original team could only dream of. In the 1940s, however, none of that was certain. What was certain was that something had taken off from the desert and made entire radar grids go quiet, and that terrified those who relied on seeing their enemy to know when to act. The YB-49 flew not like a fighter or a bomber, but like a question, a challenge, an unknown. It left no smoke trail, no acoustic signature distinguishable from high-altitude winds. If you saw it, it was already too late. If you didn't, it was even worse. That was the genius of its presence and the nightmare of its absence. If this story caught your attention, we invite you to support the channel by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let us know if you'd ever heard of the YB-49 before today. Every voice helps us keep these hidden stories alive. In the early years of the Second World War, radar was the crown jewel of German air defense. It was not just a tool, it was a belief that no aircraft could cross into German airspace unnoticed. The system was a marvel of engineering, a silent sentinel stretched across the coasts and countryside, alert to the faintest ripple in the electromagnetic spectrum. At the heart of this shield were two primary systems, Freya and Würzburg. Freya was the long-range scanner, capable of detecting aircraft up to 120 kilometers away. Würzburg, smaller and more precise, was used to track targets once identified and guide flak batteries and fighter interceptors directly to the incoming bombers. Together, they formed a lethal net, an invisible wall that had turned the skies of occupied Europe into a deadly trap. And for a time, it worked. British bombers paid a heavy price. American formations flying daylight missions were torn apart by radar-guided flak and swift Messerschmitts. The Reich felt untouchable behind this wall of signal and steel. But technology never rests, and neither did the Allies. While the Germans relied on long-established radar frequencies in the VHF and UHF bands, American scientists began probing weaknesses. They noticed that radar was blind to certain shapes, certain angles. It wasn't magic, it was physics. Traditional aircraft, like the B-17 and the Lancaster, were flying mirrors. Their vertical stabilizers and propellers bounced radar waves back like spotlights. But what if you could change the angles? What if radar waves could be deflected instead of reflected? What if the aircraft could simply slide past the radar beam like oil on water? This line of thinking birthed a revolution. Engineers in America began experimenting with flat surfaces, gentle curves, and sharp, angular designs. They tested different materials, paints infused with iron ferrite, rubber coatings, even simple wood in early tests. The goal was always the same: to break the radar signal, to scatter it like wind through grass. They discovered that shape mattered more than size. Even large objects could disappear if their design avoided the 90-degree angles and circular structures that radar waves loved to bounce off. The YB-49, with its smooth flying wing design, became a perfect laboratory for this new kind of warfare. It had no tail, no vertical fins, no protruding engine nacelles. Every surface was curved or tapered. Its flat top and bottom surfaces acted like stealth panels before stealth had a name. Radar tests were conducted under extreme secrecy. Operators were told to track a new jet passing overhead, Many times, they failed to find it at all. When it did appear, it was a flicker, a phantom. The signal was so weak that even experienced technicians dismissed it as interference. What they were witnessing was not interference. It was disappearance by design. At one testing site near Muroc Dry Lake in California, a radar operator reportedly asked if the test plane had been delayed. He was told it had just flown over him. He looked at his scope. It never showed up, he said quietly. As these findings grew, they were compiled into internal reports, marked top secret. The implications were enormous. If a bomber could be built that radar could not detect, entire strategies would collapse. Anti-aircraft defenses would be rendered useless, early warning systems would fail, and perhaps most importantly, the enemy would be blind and deaf in their own skies. It was around this time that the term radar cross-section began to gain currency. RCS was the measurement of how detectable an object was to radar. A large metal object with many flat surfaces facing the radar would have a high RCS. A smooth, angled shape like the YB-49, much lower, sometimes so low that it fell beneath the threshold of detection for most existing systems. The Germans had no answer to this. Their radar systems were built on the assumption that aircraft would behave like aircraft had always behaved: large, noisy, reflective, predictable. They had no concept of a vehicle engineered from the start to be invisible to radar. The irony is bitter. Germany had pioneered early radar in the 1930s. They had developed the first airborne radar sets, the first radar-controlled gun sights. They had trusted the science so deeply that they forgot to question its limitations. By 1945, that trust would become a liability, and the Americans would exploit it with ruthless precision. This was not brute force. This was subtraction. Subtraction of reflection. Subtraction of visibility. Subtraction of certainty. A plane that left no echo on radar was more than a machine. It was a psychological weapon. It did not announce its arrival. It did not provoke response. It simply existed in the space between detection and destruction. And when the first reports came in from radar operators in Germany of aircraft that came and went without ever appearing on their scopes, it wasn't disbelief that followed. It was silence. The same silence that radar could not fill. If this journey through forgotten innovations in wartime aviation is resonating with you, we'd be honored if you joined the community. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe if you haven't already. These stories deserve to be heard by more than just historians. In the final months of the war, when most eyes were fixed on the collapsing Eastern Front and the tightening noose from the west, a different kind of operation unfolded high above the North Sea. There were no headlines, no official records, and for years, no confirmation that it even happened. But for a handful of engineers, pilots, and radar operators, one night in early 1945 marked a turning point that felt less like a mission and more like a whisper from the future. The aircraft lifted off from a remote airfield under cover of darkness. No lights, no markings, just the metallic reflection of moonlight dancing across the edges of its sleek wing. The ground crew stood silently as it climbed into the cold, thin air. There were no speeches, no fanfare, just a sense of quiet tension. What flew that night wasn't designed to fight. It wasn't armed. It wasn't meant to dogfight or strafe or even drop a bomb. Its purpose was much simpler and far more dangerous. Its job was to vanish. The crew on board monitored their instruments closely as they crossed over the English Channel, heading toward the northern Germans' coastline. Everything remained normal. The altimeter held steady. The engine tones were smooth. The air was still. But something strange happened as they approached enemy territory. Nothing happened. No radar lock, no scramble alert, no response from anti-aircraft batteries, no interceptors launched to meet them in the night. The usual choreography of defenses was absent, silent, sleeping. They continued their flight deeper into hostile airspace. Still no sign of detection. The plane was moving through one of the most fortified regions in northern Germany without triggering a single reaction. Then the crew passed over their target. Below them sat a logistical depot, responsible for supplying thousands of soldiers across the Western Front. It was protected by multiple flak batteries and surrounded by radar stations that had intercepted Allied bombers for years. But tonight, the sky above that depot was still. The only sound was the faint buzz of the aircraft's 8 jet engines, barely audible from the ground. A soft breath in the night, and then a flash. A signal from the onboard systems, confirmation that the flyover had succeeded. The aircraft turned, banked left, and disappeared back into the night sky, just as quietly as it had arrived. 2 minutes later, the silence broke. A separate formation of conventional bombers roared in from the west. These were the Hammer. The decoy flight had been the Ghost. The bombs fell with brutal precision. Fuel depots, ammunition, warehouses, vehicle convoys, all erased in seconds, and when the fires reached the sky, the ground finally responded. Black guns opened up. Searchlights swept desperately across the heavens. German pilots scrambled to intercept. Radar operators shouted into radios, but it was too late. The bombers had already turned back. The damage was done, and no one ever saw the first plane. In the official German after-action reports, the cause of the security failure was unclear. Some blamed radar malfunction. Others cited crew fatigue. But a few sharp minds noticed something far more unsettling. The radar logs showed a gap of complete silence at the exact moment the unidentified aircraft passed through. Not interference, not static, just absence, like someone had erased a portion of reality. One radar technician noted in his report that the equipment had been functioning correctly. The scope was clean. But he wrote one sentence at the bottom of the page that said more than all the E charts above it. The sky was empty, and then it wasn't. That single line was passed through multiple levels of command. Quiet meetings were held behind closed doors. Some believed it was sabotage. Others thought it was an experimental British weapon. But one officer, a veteran of the Luftwaffe since Poland, shook his head. "We're not fighting planes anymore," he said. "We're fighting ghosts." The psychological effect of that flight rippled through the radar cores. In the weeks that followed, false reports began to increase. Operators claimed to hear engines but couldn't see targets. Searchlights were triggered by shadows that weren't there. Pilots flew intercept missions and returned reporting nothing. Paranoia crept in, because now they understood that silence didn't mean safety. It meant something might be moving through their skies undetected. And once that thought took root, the effectiveness of the radar system itself began to collapse. Confidence was eroded. Discipline weakened. Every echo became a question. Every gap became a threat. Not because of what the aircraft did, but because of what it didn't do. It didn't show up. And for a regime obsessed with control, that was the deepest cut of all. If this story made you feel something, we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. These forgotten fragments of history deserve a place in today's memory. Fear rarely begins with explosions. It begins in silence, in moments where expectation collapses under uncertainty. And for the radar crews stationed along the northern German front in 1945, fear began not with what they saw, but with what they no longer did. The systems were working. Lights glowed, dials turned, oscilloscopes pulsed with rhythm. Nothing was broken, but something was wrong. Operators who had trained for years to trust their machines found themselves frozen in front of blank screens, waiting for targets that never appeared, until they did, when it was too late. And as the silence grew longer, their confidence grew smaller. It started with subtle changes in behavior. Crews double-checked frequencies even when everything was aligned. Teams ran diagnostic protocols 3 or 4 times per shift. Officers began requesting manual visual confirmation before sounding alarms. It slowed everything down. One operator stationed near Hamburg was reprimanded for failing to activate the alert system during a surprise bombing. At TE, report was simple. The radar said the sky was empty. I believed it. In the weeks that followed, more operators hesitated. Some began erring on the side of denial. If nothing showed up, then nothing was coming. It was safer than raising another false alarm and risking disciplinary action. But this caution bred something worse than error. It bred vulnerability. At the heart of the Reich's air defense doctrine was a belief in certainty. The system would detect, the guns would fire, the planes would scramble. But now, Certainty had eroded, and with it, so did discipline. Fighter pilots reported receiving scramble orders too late. Anti-aircraft units began firing preemptively into empty skies, wasting precious ammunition. Entire sectors hesitated to respond to strange noises, waiting for radar confirmation that never came. In some units, orders were issued to shoot at anything that moved. In others, gun crews refused to engage without command verification. There was no standard, just confusion. And in war, confusion is fatal. The psychological damage spread like smoke through the ranks. Rumors took root. Stories of a silent aircraft that could fly over entire cities without being detected. Whispers of American ghost planes built in secret bases that defied every rule of physics. Some even believed the Allies had found a way to jam radar signals completely. There was no single explanation, just a growing sense of helplessness. And fear needs no proof to spread. An experienced radar officer once described the feeling in a post-war interview. He said it was like watching a door that should never open slowly begin to creak. You keep telling yourself the lock is still in place, but your hands begin to sweat anyway. What the Allies had achieved, knowingly or not, was the destabilization of an entire defensive infrastructure. Not through firepower, but through doubt. The moment your enemy no longer trusts their own instruments, they begin to fight shadows. And the German Radar Corps had begun to do exactly that. Operators started reporting phantoms, echoes that vanished, sudden returns that blinked in and out of existence. Technicians were ordered to recalibrate systems that had no technical faults. Commanders demanded answers that no one could give. On March 17, 1945, a Luftwaffe unit near Bremen opened fire on what was believed to be a formation of enemy bombers. The sky was clear. The radar showed faint blips, indistinct and erratic. The gunners fired for 10 minutes. Nothing fell. Nothing exploded. The next morning, a reconnaissance patrol found no wreckage, no parachutes, no signs of intrusion. The gunners were certain they had seen something, but certainty no longer meant what it used to. This new kind of warfare, psychological, indirect, invisible, was unfamiliar to the German command structure. Trained for direct confrontation and rooted in engineering precision, they were not prepared for a battlefield where ghosts were more dangerous than tanks. And still, no one could explain exactly what was happening. The Americans never claimed responsibility. The aircraft never appeared in official Allied press briefings. The radar gaps were never addressed by enemy broadcasts. It was as if the sky itself had decided to betray its watchers. But behind closed doors, American engineers knew what was working. They understood that the YB-49, while still experimental, had achieved something extraordinary. Not total invisibility, but enough ambiguity to paralyze a system built on clarity. In the war room, this was referred to in coded language, minimal return, reduced visibility, electromagnetic irregularities. But to the men sitting in bunkers, watching blank scopes, it was something else entirely. It was dread, and dread does not need permission to take hold. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, support the mission by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. History is more than dates and battles. It is tension, silence, and the human heart under pressure. War is often imagined in explosions, smoke, and fire. But in 1945, a new battlefield opened, one that was invisible, quiet, and pulsing with energy. A war not fought with bullets or bombs, but with frequencies. In this new dimension, the weapons were not guns, but signals. And the victors were not just pilots, but scientists and engineers in lab coats, staring at oscilloscopes instead of gun sights. The Germans had pioneered the use of radar at the beginning of the war. Their systems like Freya and Würzburg had helped them anticipate Allied bombing raids with deadly accuracy. But the Allies were catching up and then surpassing, not just in radar capability, but in a deeper understanding of how to manipulate the electromagnetic battlefield. This wasn't just countermeasures. This was strategy. It was the birth of electronic warfare. The idea was simple. If you could not hide your plane from radar, then confuse the radar, or overwhelm it, or feed it false signals. Let the enemy fire at nothing while your true formation slipped through the gaps. And when the YB-49 entered the equation, already nearly invisible to conventional radar returns, it became the perfect instrument in a symphony of disruption. American operations began deploying aircraft like the EC-121 Warning Star and modified B-24s equipped with electronic jamming systems. These aircraft would fly ahead or alongside bomber formations, flooding German radar bands with noise, white noise, false echoes, broken pulses. It was like trying to listen to a whispered conversation through a room full of screaming radios. The Germans responded with frequency hopping, attempts to switch channels, recalibrate, redirect antennas. But every move they made was mirrored by Allied codebreakers who fed that information back into the system in real time. It became a deadly chess game played in wavelengths. One example was Operation Window, a British tactic that involved dropping clouds of thin metallic strips, called chaff, from planes during bombing raids. These strips, each cut to the same length as the radar's wavelength, would reflect the signal back to the radar operator, simulating hundreds of aircraft. The screens lit up like fireworks, and in the chaos, the real planes passed through unnoticed. But the Americans wanted more than confusion. They wanted silence. What they were aiming for was not just to disrupt radar, but to render it irrelevant. They wanted the Germans to question the very foundation of their defense. And with the arrival of radar-minimal aircraft, that possibility became real. During one unconfirmed mission in the spring of 1945, an American aircraft approached a radar installation without using any jamming or chaff. It simply flew in at high altitude with its flat, angular body, absorbing and deflecting radar signals. The radar crew reported a momentary flicker on the screen, then nothing. 5 minutes later, their installation was destroyed. No alarms had sounded. No guns were fired. Post-war interviews with surviving German radar officers confirmed their growing awareness of a phenomenon they could not explain. One officer described it as a cold emptiness moving through our detection zone. Another said, "We began to doubt our own machines, and once doubt enters the system dies." The battlefield was no longer limited to cities and skies. It now lived inside the very brains of the people who monitored the defense grid. That doubt was a victory in itself, because when a radar operator hesitates to believe what he sees or doesn't see, the entire command chain slows down. And when command slows down, air power slips through. There was a name whispered among some of the American electronic warfare specialists. They called it the Phantom Strategy, not because it involved ghost planes, but because it made the enemy chase ghosts of their own imagining, sounds that weren't there, lights that blinked too late, shadows with no source. The YB-49 was not alone in this strategy. It was part of a growing ecosystem of deception. American engineers were experimenting with directional jamming, where signals could be focused like a beam to blind specific radar installations without affecting others. They used Doppler tricks to alter the perceived speed of an incoming aircraft. Some tests even explored ways to mimic the radar signature of different aircraft, making a single plane look like a formation. And while many of these projects were classified, the results became increasingly obvious on the battlefield. German flak crews complained of wasted ammunition. Pilots scrambled to meet threats that vanished. Resources were shifted to reinforce positions that had never been targeted. The Reich began chasing phantoms, and every time they did, they bled time, energy, and control. The ghost in the sky was no longer just the aircraft. It was the entire system designed to make that aircraft invisible. And it was winning. If this unraveling of hidden warfare fascinates you the way it fascinates us, help us keep the memory alive. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to support this journey through the shadows of history. Every voice helps us keep these stories from disappearing, just like the aircraft that once slipped through enemy skies unseen. The myth of German engineering during the Second World War has echoed through time. Precision, innovation, bold experimentation. These were the traits the world came to associate with the technological power of the Reich. From jet fighters to ballistic missiles, from magnetic mines to guided bombs, the German war machine seemed born from the minds of men who believed that genius could outpace industry. But there is a difference between building something brilliant and building something at scale. The Germans had the Horten brothers, brilliant designers, visionaries. They dreamed of flying wings long before the concept became fashionable. Their Ho-229 was sleek, fast, and unlike anything else in the sky. In theory, it could outperform Allied aircraft and even reduce radar visibility thanks to its wooden skin and curved shape. But dreams are not enough in war. The Ho-229 flew only a handful of times and never saw combat. It was a sketch of the future drawn too late. The Americans, on the other hand, had Jack Northrop, and they had something else even more dangerous: factories. While German engineers sketched prototypes in bunkers and workshops, the Americans turned ideas into production lines. While the Reich struggled with raw materials, labor shortages, and constant bombardment, the United States mobilized entire cities to build parts, assemble fuselages, and test engines around the clock. This contrast was not just technical, it was cultural. The Germans placed their faith in brilliance. The Americans placed theirs in systems. It was this philosophy that made the impossible possible. A radar minimal bomber was not just invented, it was tested, improved, and refined by teams that included scientists, machinists, pilots, and logistics officers, all moving under a single industrial rhythm. Every setback was analyzed, every crash dissected, every flight logged. Progress was iterative and relentless. The Northrop YB-49 may have begun as a visionary leap, but it became a product of organized momentum, a glimpse into a new kind of war, driven not by lone inventors, but by industrial evolution. And this scared the Germans more than any bomb, because they had seen it before. They saw it in the endless stream of Sherman tanks rolling off American lines, in the waves of Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, in the clouds of B-17s darkening the sky. It was not elegance, it was not genius, it was something worse. It was unstoppable. The YB-49 was, in many ways, a symbol of this philosophy, a machine that looked like science fiction but came to life through manufacturing, precision, and logistical discipline. Even if it never entered full combat service, it had already served its purpose. It proved that invisibility was no longer a fantasy, that radar, the guardian of the Reich's skies, could be outmaneuvered not just by technology, but by the collective force of an industrial empire that learned faster than it failed. Years later, during interrogations of captured German officers, a few admitted something surprising. They had known, not about the YB-49 specifically, but about the shift, the growing realization that they were no longer facing the same enemy from 1942. The Americans had changed. They had evolved. One officer put it plainly: they stopped reacting and started thinking. We were still solving problems one by one. They were designing systems that solved entire categories of problems before they happened. The war had moved from the battlefield to the drawing board, and from the drawing board to the assembly line. Every aircraft, every component, every tactic became part of a larger machine, one that did not pause for brilliance, but consumed it, refined it, and deployed it with efficiency. It was no longer just about who had the best pilots or the most agile fighters. It was about who could build faster, adapt quicker, and execute relentlessly. The Germans could not keep up, and the true terror of the YB-49 was not in what it could do, but in what it represented. It was the first whisper of a doctrine the world would not understand until decades later. That in the wars to come, stealth would matter more than speed. That silence would outweigh shock, and that whoever controlled the spectrum, the space between sound and sight, would control the future of warfare. By the time the war ended, the aircraft had returned to its hangar. The engineers moved on. The files were sealed, but a seed had been planted, not just in the minds of those who built it, but in the minds of those who heard of it or never saw it, yet still felt its effects. That is the true power of an idea backed by industry. It doesn't just change the present, it redefines what is possible. If this story left you thinking differently about how wars are really won, let us know in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the forgotten truths that shaped the modern world, consider subscribing. Your support helps keep history alive and visible. no matter how invisible it once tried to be. They laughed. That's how it began, with laughter, in corridors lined with maps and medals, with smirks passed between radar officers and whispers among engineers who thought they had already seen the future and had nothing left to fear. The idea of an invisible aircraft was absurd to them, impractical, impossible, a child's fantasy. And yet, by the spring of 1945, that laughter had stopped, because the silence had arrived. Not the silence of peace, but of something much more unsettling. A silence that hovered in the sky where alarms used to ring. A silence that crept across radar screens that once pulsed with confidence. A silence that spoke of presence, without visibility. What the Reich had built with equations, the Allies dismantled with innovation. What German engineering had constructed in labs and bunkers. American industry buried beneath waves of steel and signal. But perhaps the deepest wound was not physical. It was psychological. The German military, once secure in the precision of its detection systems, was now haunted by a simple truth. They could no longer see the enemy. And when you cannot see, you cannot fight. By the final weeks of the war, radar crews stared at empty skies with the gnawing fear that something was always there, just out of reach. Every anomaly became a threat, every echo a question, every second of calm a possible lie. The YB-49 was not deployed en masse. It was never mass-produced, never unleashed in numbers large enough to reshape battles on its own. But that was never the point. Didn't need to bomb cities or dogfight Messerschmitts. Its existence alone was the weapon. It proved that invisibility was not a fantasy. It proved that radar could be outwitted by shape, by material, by silence. And it proved that the next generation of war would not be won by brute force or brilliant tactics, but by the ability to disappear. The Germans called it a ghost, but it wasn't supernatural. It was mechanical, intentional, designed, a machine born from the desert and baptized in secrecy. It passed overhead not with a roar, but with a whisper that unraveled everything the enemy believed to be true. And in that unraveling, a new kind of warfare was born, one where visibility was vulnerability, one where silence was strategy, one where power was no longer measured by how loud you could strike, but by how quietly you could exist. After the war, the surviving fragments of this philosophy lived on, in black projects, in hangars with no windows, in the minds of engineers who had glimpsed the future and couldn't look away. Decades later, that future would return, shaped like a black triangle, coated in radar-absorbing paint, gliding above foreign lands unseen. The spirit of the YB-49 reborn as the B-2 bomber, a child of silence, the inheritor of the Ghost's legacy. But long before that aircraft ever took flight, the legend had already been written. Not in documents or combat reports, but in the eyes of the men who stared at radar screens that told them the world was safe, only to hear the explosions moments later. That was when they knew. They were not alone in the sky, and they would never laugh again. Thank you for taking this journey through a forgotten chapter of aviation history. If this story stirred something in you, we invite you to leave a comment, subscribe, and help us continue revealing the echoes of a past that still shapes our world today. And now, if you're ready for another story that history tried to bury, click on the next video appearing on your screen. There's more waiting for you just beneath the surface.